Yo, parish orphans and retrogrades. On Monday, we began a deep dive into most important encyclical of the last 200 years, Rerum Novarum, by none other than Leo XIII, the greatest non-canonized pope ever. He finds himself, I believe in heaven, with a special relevance here on earth now because Pope Leo XIV told the world that he chose his name on behalf of Leo XIII's name, and particularly because of the Rerum Novarum encyclical. Today, we're going to finish going through the deep dive on Rerum Novarum. That won't take
just one
long.
second, Tim. I have to fix your audio. I don't know what happened there.
Okay. Can anyone
Sorry.
hear any of that?
I think they could barely.
Oh.
Sorry. Yeah, they got you. Hold on. Okay, try now.
Okay. How about now?
Let us know in chat if that's better. Sorry about that, everybody.
We continue that deep dive. In other words, from Monday. I don't know what to say. To give a short version of what I said, Monday we did the deep dive into this special relevance encyclical by Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum. It's especially relevant now again because of the current pope who said he took his name for Leo XIII and specifically for Rerum Novarum. It's specifically necessary because Rerum Novarum is addressed in a unique way to Americans. It's addressed to all the world. We're going to conclude that today, starting, I believe we left off at paragraph 43. We got 2/3 of the way through. It won't take long because the most important stuff was, I would say, said last time. But after we finish with Rerum Novarum, we're going to go through Longínqua, another Pope Leo XIII encyclical that was written 4 years later. Remember, Rerum was written in 1891. Longínqua was written in 1895. 4 years after that, Pope Leo writes Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae, a letter that's kind of like a mini encyclical to the United States bishops. These three letters, that's all an encyclical is, after all, it's a magisterial letter, couple together, pair together nicely. Those are both words for grouping of two. We need a word for a grouping of three. They're a nice triplicate together as the American Pope is finding his footing in the throne of Peter for the first time. This book, Catholic Republic, my first ever, the one I spent nearly a decade really researching and writing, is of special relevance again. So if you want to know what we talked about in even greater depth Monday, today, including what we say about Longínqua and Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae, these three letters go together. This book is the deep dive on the meaning of all those three. It's not necessarily about all those three specifically. They're all cited. And mainly we unpack the meaning in terms of, in America, natural rights, subsidiarity, virtue ethics, the opposite of church-state separation, the union of church and state, which was what early America stood for until 1947. Proper economy, and of course, science, technology, Aristotelianism. These are the 6 chapters, and I explain how they're all creatures of the natural law, and they're all creatures of the natural law that are unpacked in these 3 letters from Leo XIII. Rerum, Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae, and of course, Longínqua. And we're going to run through Longínqua and Testem Benevolentiae after we finish with Rerum today. And we got most of the way through it last time, but there are some important concluding thoughts. First, I want to call your attention to something special about this channel. What is it? The matchmaking that I've engaged in for the last 2 years with my friends Will and Nick. We saw 7 or 8 engagements and with marriages. I'm forgetting whether it's exactly 7 or 8. And that was from a reasonably small pool of paying men who paid to be matched. The women did not pay to be matched. We saw either 14 or 16 married people from a reasonably small pool of payers. The men pay, the women don't. I want to, with Steph and with actually Jillian Curvers, who offered a course for me, continue that starting this spring and summer, that lineage, won't be making matches with Will or Nick anymore, but that job ran its course. And of course, we learned a lot, and we want to continue matchmaking. It was a truly enjoyable way to make a buck, to help you guys, and to disprove naysayers. People were saying, you're not going to see a single marriage. Within really the first year and a half, we saw almost all of those, let's just call it 7 to be conservative, couplings, at least become engagements. And it really has been wound down for the last 6 months. We weren't doing much work with it at all. And people have been asking, I heard you had a lot of engagements, and I get emails all the time. You disproved your naysayers. Are you going to open it back up?
We just got a wedding invitation 2 days ago.
Yeah.
From one of our matches. Yeah.
From I think that final match, we got that wedding invitation, and the answer is yes. I'm going to be spinning back up matchmaking. We're doing that today. So there's a new button on timothyjgordon.com for any of you men or women who are interested. The matchmaking is available. Men pay, women don't. But this time, one of the lessons we learned is we need a little fast 3-day, it's not all day, 3-class course, where we talk about, here's really the things all men and women need to know to date. You can take this course even if you aren't enrolled in our matchmaking, but the men and the women do pay the small fee for the course, and that's our prerequisite to join. It solves a lot of the problems, the minor problems that we were seeing, externalities with folks that joined the matchmaking pool. When we were doing it with Will and Nick the last 2 years. So the answer is yes. If you go to timothyjgordon.com and you click matchmaking.
Yes, it is timothyjgordon.com, and there's a matchmaking/date coaching tab right at the top.
Right, and the date coaching is a series of private coaching and even a class with Jillian Curvers, who will be helping us to make the match. That's my first cousin. She's like a sister to me. She offered a class for free to my audience, and it was wildly popular, and we just said this needs to go back. Also, if you already are married and you need coaching, Steph and I do 2x2 marriage coaching that's sort of coupled to this whole thing. We, of course, at Rules for Retrograde, Steph and I really have developed an apostolate for how to do patriarchy, that is to say, Christian marriage, properly. And how to do it properly is something that can be coached. It's also something we've written about over the course of 3 books. Steph's book, solo, is Ask Your Husband. The last one we co-wrote together is Leave and Cleave. This is the most specifics about how to keep a patriarchal marriage together. And of course, the original was The Case for Patriarchy by myself. I don't have a copy on hand. So you can read the books. We've taught classes, and now we are doing 2x2 coaching. That's gone very well. The first cohort is mostly through. We're looking to take in a second cohort of 7 or 8 couples. We don't try to scale everything super large. Same thing with the matchmaking. We're not trying to scale it. We don't want a pool of 1,000 where we don't know the profiles well. What we did well before, when we did the return matchmaking with Nick and Will, is we knew the profiles well. And so it was easy when someone new would come in. You'd think back on that file, that profile that we read a month or 2 months ago and say, here's the perfect match for that person. Keep it small. It's already a small community of retrogrades and parish orphans. This is why we have through the roof comparative numbers to other matchmaking sites and, of course, dating sites, which just don't work, as any of these people will tell you.
Nope.
Dating sites don't work. But even compared to other matchmaking sites, from our reasonably small pools, to get 14 or 16 people married over the course of 15 months, or at least engaged to be married, is amazing numbers. So go to timothyjgordon.com. Mainly what we're going to be looking for is how much interest, how big a pool can we get this time around?
There is an email. If you are interested, just email. There's a form right there on the screen. Just email us and let us know. We're really excited.
Also, as always, if you already are married, get yourself out of your blue state. Get to a red state today. Go to www.realestateforlife.org. Get out of your blue state. Get to a red state today. today. Okay, so we left off on paragraph 43 of Rerum Novarum.
Okay. Let me get that up.
The 40s are I would say the late 30s and early 40s are the paragraphs in Rerum that I guess most people associate with it. It's essentially Pope Leo XIII saying, even though, yes, as I noted earlier in the encyclical, religion is the best way to bring together capital and labor, as we talked about last time. Labor and capital are not enemies. They go together like a wink and a nod. They should not be hostile to each other, same as men and women shouldn't be hostile to each other. One man and one woman goes together when they're temperamentally paired, like a wink and a nod. Same thing with labor and capital. And it's only the socialists who are bringing this spurious narrative that labor and capital ought to hate one another. So Leo has said, in the first 42 paragraphs, the main duty of bringing them together should be dealt with by religion, by making people virtuous, both the rich in the pews on a Sunday Mass and the poor, both labor and capital on a Sunday Mass, are sitting in the pews, and they're each admonished to fulfill their Christian duties to one another, including the duty of charity. So between the private virtue inculcated by religion and religion itself, and by that we only mean there's only one true religion, Roman Catholicism, most of the problems that arise between labor and capital can be avoided or elided or overcome. But there are some that remain, and now we get to the normier conception, the more brainwashed sort of boomer conception of this encyclical. What is the role of really the state in allowing unions? And I find the paragraphs in the 40s reasonably redundant ways of Leo XIII expressing himself that unions are good. They should be allowed. They shouldn't be pernicious. They shouldn't be overly aggressive. They shouldn't be run by socialists. And they should always bring one back to the cause of religion. People need big families and they need to have enough time to get their families to Mass. And they shouldn't be the first resort of, let's say, labor, when labor is running foul of capital. But there's a role for them. So in 43, the most important sentence is this: the only way, it is said, in which injustice might occur would be if the master refused to pay the whole of the wages, or if the workman should not complete the work undertaken. In such cases, the public authority should intervene to see that each obtains his due, but not under any other circumstances. So there's also the call of Christian charity that labor and capital should have for one another. But the main harm to be avoided is that the master needs to pay wages, and they should be fair wages, and needs to actually care about the dignity of his worker. And the workers need to complete the work undertaken, and not just barely, in a really, really dignified way. That's paragraph 43. And it says, so in such cases, the public authority should intervene if the lopsided power dynamic, which of course, because it's a power dynamic, it favors the more powerful, the richer. If the less powerful party needs help, the laws and the public lawfare should take this onus on themselves. It's pretty obvious. None of this is really cutting edge, and that's why the most cutting edge dimensions of Rerum Novarum are what you read in the first 2/3 of it. Holy cow, property law is rendered in this social encyclical a natural right. It had never been considered quite a natural right before that. I had people pressing back on Twitter, idiotically, they're welcome to jump on and rebut me today, that Thomas Aquinas really had said that private property was a natural right. I'll read you briefly the proof text. Aquinas is, and I just screenshotted it. I'll let you know exactly the question in the article later, but he's replying. It's you never want to find yourself in Aquinas's replies to objection 1. He says, but because the division of possessions is not according to the natural law, but rather arose from human agreement, which belongs to positive law, as stated above, Hence, the ownership of possessions is not contrary to the natural law, but an addition thereto devised by human reason. So what I kept saying, and he says this in a few different places, what I continued to say throughout all of the first run through this on Monday was that it's natural law adjacent. It's a requirement of reason. Natural reason is part of the natural law, but it's not a natural law right, or what we call a natural right. Actually, John Locke, 200 years before Leo in 1891, basically beat us to the punch. He's a Protestant and an Enlightenment thinker. And folks did not like to hear that there's anything positive in the writings of Mr. John Locke, but this is what the study of philosophy and even the study of law calls us to, is we have to repudiate our reflexes a lot of times, our intellectual reflexes. Locke gets this right. I also misspoke. I cited 3 ghost authors of this, all from the Angelicum. Really what it was is one of those 3, whose name begins with a Z, was a Thomist professor at the Angelicum. He had been reading older members of his generation from right around before then, some of whom had died before the passage of Rerum Novarum. Those other 2 names I read you.
Was this really the critiques you're getting?
That was
you're getting henpecked because you forgot like a name or a place.
Yeah.
From all the analysis that you did last time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Twitter. Thank you for being annoying.
Well, it's people that don't have anything interesting to add, wanting to critique in a way that isn't really valid. Someone that's adding something interesting to the conversation, because almost all of the responses I got after Monday's show is, holy cow, I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. So this Angelicum professor, who really was the ghost author of Rerum Novarum, he really was the last of the 3 names I read. His name began with a Z. He basically did the first draft of this, and he was a Lockean Thomist at the Angelicum, the Pontifical University of St. Thomas in Rome. Correct. And he really was using 2 older scholars. One of them was a Jesuit, maybe out of the Gregorian University, which is right down the street from the Ange. Those 2 other names I correctly read were also Lockean Thomists. They just weren't professors at the Angelicum, and one of whom died shortly before Rerum Novarum was written. So they weren't actually ghost author. They were just kind of ghost author citations. But it was absolutely correct. It was only Lockean Thomists, the 3 names I read you, who influenced directly or indirectly Leo XIII to publish this document, which elevated private property to a natural law right. Also, the boundary conditions, the elements, as we say in law, of subsidiarity are laid out here, and it will only be kind of Rerum Novarum Part 2, which is released not by Leo XIII, but Pius XI, 40 years later in an encyclical called 40 Years Later, Quadragesimo Anno, that Pius names Leo's doctrine. And guess what? Pius and Leo both say of Leo's doctrine that would later be called subsidiarity, that it is a natural law requirement, that it is naturally wrong. It's a grave injustice for a more distant governing body to occupy the legislative field, which is the competence of a more proximate legislative body. So anytime the state does something that fathers in general, that's what I meant by generically, fathers in general are capable of doing, it's a grave evil. It's like a collective mortal sin. This is very important because you get post-liberals and post-liberal thinkers a lot of times who say, well, this one father didn't do his job, so therefore it devolves to the state to do the job. No, it's not in particular. If one particular father is a deadbeat dad, that now fathering falls to the state. No, it's in general. Fathers are very competent to father their kids, to provide for their kids. And so the state should never do this. This is why it's such a bold repudiation of socialism, is because we're considering what, say, fathers or local government can do in general. And Pope Pius XI, when he names Leo's doctrine subsidiarity, he gives it that definition I read to you on Monday's show, where he says, in general, generically, If the state occupies a legislative field that's generically competent by either the smaller state, right? Like in America, we actually have these state governments, or in Canada, provincial governments. If the Fed does something a state should do, that's a mortal sin, basically. It's a grave evil. If the state takes over something that the municipal city government can do, that's a grave evil. And if the municipal government takes over a role that really pertains to the father, that's a grave evil. That's subsidiarity. You've been lied to about the definition of subsidiarity. And guess what? Most of what we call the legislative or governing functions fall to the father. That's not libertarianism. We've seen Rerum Novarum does not allow straight libertarianism. It's just very, very small government. The father of the family can do most everything, which is why America is such a proof text for subsidiarity, because these guys would move to the frontier and they had virtually no interaction with any kind of government. They fought off the Indians on their own on the frontier. They never had any kind of interaction with anyone but like the marshal. Once every 5 years, they'd see the federal marshal. And they didn't really do much in terms of paying taxes or requisitions, and they just raised their families in God's nature. It proves the case, and big government people, big government conservatives are really threatened by this dimension of Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno. That's what's interesting about all of this. Okay, so that's mainly the cutting edge stuff that we covered last time. 2 new doctrines introduced by this one encyclical. Private property is a natural right that gave the Thomistic previous Catholic doctrine an upgrade. And number 2, subsidiarity. For the first time we really ever knew what it was, he lays it out. And those both require very small government, but people will cite this as a big government doctrine just because of this stuff here in the 40s where Leo XIII is saying, yeah, labor unions are fine. They have to be Catholic and they can't have any of the trappings of socialism. Now, if you go to paragraph 44, the next one, the most interesting sentence here is that he says, now, were we to consider labor merely insofar as it is personal, he says it's both personal and it's got another dimension as well. Doubtless, then it would be within the workman's right to accept any rate of wages whatsoever. For in the same way as he is free to work or not, so is he free to accept a small wage or even none at all. But our conclusion must be very different. If together with the personal element of man's work, we consider the fact that work is all necessary. So it's necessary and it's personal. Because it's necessary, this means that you can't just, if you're capital, you can't just squeeze your employee and say, I'll give you a penny a day. This violates the natural law, because it's not just like he's contracting to do art or something fun for you. He's contracting to do something he needs to do. Work is both personal and necessary. That's why it's such a grave imposition on employers. The great imposition here is on employers themselves under pain of hell. If you take advantage of your workers, you will go to hell. It's that simple. And the church is the best intermediary, not the state. Leo XIII says that a few times in the earlier passages. But if the employer's conscience fails and then church fails, or maybe this employer doesn't go to mass on Sunday, then yes, as a last resort, the state can get involved because of the dual dimension. It's not just that labor is personal, it's also necessary. Necessary for the various purposes of life, and chief of all for self-preservation. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. Okay, paragraph 45. This is a very fascinating paragraph. I think the most interesting one of the second half, because I claim that not only does Rerum Novarum uphold private property, which is a very right-wing thing, but the other element of what's been slurred as capitalism, I call it free enterprise. The second dimension of real free enterprise as 2 elements is private property and private contract, the liberty of private contract. Listen to what 45 says about private contract. It's very right-wing. Let the working man and the employer make free agreements. And in particular, let them agree freely as to the wages. So even off the heels of what was said in paragraph 44, Yeah, the employer shouldn't be squeezing or gouging the smallest possible wages because of that necessity component. The worker has to work. You shouldn't take advantage of this. 45 begins with, let the working man and the employer make free agreements. In particular, let them agree freely as to the wages. Nevertheless, there underlies a dictate of natural justice more imperious and ancient than any bargain between man and man, namely, that wages ought not to be so insufficient to support a frugal and well-behaved wage earner. Now, two things here. Leo is calling our minds back to the fact that the main barrier to injustice between the labor and capital is the conscience of the employer. He should pay a wage that's fair, not merely the lowest amount that he can get away with paying the worker. And also, Leo supplies the reason why that wages ought not to be insufficient to support a frugal, and well-behaved wage earner. If through necessity or fear of a worse evil, the workmen accept harder conditions, because an employer or contractor will afford him no better, he is made the victim of force and injustice. So this calls us back to mind that workers are supposed to be able to support, as the heads of their households, the men, their households on a single income. And remember, a couple centuries before this, you had the Catechism of Trent saying women should really never leave the house aside from necessity. So the church is always assuming that married women are not wage earners, and it's reinforced here. Okay. 46, it's reinforced. We have seen that this great labor question cannot be solved, say, by assuming as a principle that private ownership must be held sacred and inviolable. So he's saying we don't want the government intervening in private contract or private property except as a very last resort. The law, therefore, should favor ownership, and its policy should be to induce as many as possible of the people to become owners, not by distributism, not by giving away land. Well, where does that land come from? There's no new lands that have been undiscovered on the face of the earth. They're just saying, we want employers to pay really fair wages to their employees, who should all be men who head their households and their wives stay home. And we want those households to have as much disposable income to buy as much property of their own as they can. Pretty straightforward. The last sentences of the next paragraph, 47, go through some advantages which follow from this. Excellent results. The third advantage is the most interesting. You know the first two. The third advantage would spring from this. Men would cling to the country in which they were born, for no one would exchange his country for a foreign land if his own afforded him the means of living a decent and happy life. So we don't want immigration. That's another missed component of this document. It assumes we don't want a bunch of mass immigration. We want all the countries of the world to have decent lawfare, which supports, the not the indigent, but the lowly, the common worker in that country. So we don't need this narrative of, Central and South Americans need to go north. Why? Have your own revolution, right? Have a 1776 moment where you lobby, or dare I say even sweat and bleed for justice. It is your natural right. Natural revolutions occur. It's a fourth right. The right to rebel kicks in if the government is seriously violating the right to life, liberty, or property. There's a fourth one that kicks in conditionally. It's the right to revolt. Thomas Aquinas supports it. So that's how it's supposed to work. We don't want a bunch of immigration. It's not normal. Americans who think this is normal, I live in Arizona or California or Texas or New Mexico. There's just immigrations from the South is just a major thing. There are just illegals pouring into the country every day. No, that's wrong. The third advantage would be that people would cling to their own country, the country where they were born, for no one would exchange his country for a foreign land if his own afforded them the means of living a decent and happy life. And the fact that people from Mexico and Guatemala and further South Central America and even South America flee to America, this represents a failure a failure of that country. And we don't talk about that enough. Why? When I used to live in California, I was born and raised there. There will be Mexican illegal immigrants waving Mexican flags. These are the countries that you spurned and whose governments spurned you, left you to the dogs, and the pimps and the drug dealers, such that you came here. Why are you waving a Mexican flag? It makes no sense. So Leo the 13th would agree with us here. Yes, pay workers, even pay immigrant workers, a fair share. But remember why you have to do this. Remember why they had to immigrate in the first place. These benefits can be reckoned on only provided that a man's means be not drained and exhausted by, he means the capital now, by excessive taxation. Listen to what he says about excessive taxation. Right-wing document.
Is this still paragraph 47?
Yeah, this is the last two sentences of 47.
Oh, okay.
The right to possess private property is derived from nature, not from man. So for the idiots out there that were saying this was not a revolutionary right-wing private property document, he says it one more time, that the right to private property is derived from nature. He's actually adding to Thomas, using Locke. And the state has the right to control its use in the interests of the public good alone, but by no means to absorb it altogether. The state would therefore be unjust and cruel if under the name of taxation it were to deprive the private owner of more than is fair. You can read Suarez saying this. Taxation, onerous taxation is a right of revolution. You can read Bellarmine saying this. You can read Thomas sticking up for the right of rebellion and insinuating heavy taxation is one of the just causes. You can read Augustine saying that onerous taxation by the state is no different than being beset by a band of thieves on the highway. Augustine says that. So if you can't believe Augustine, Aquinas, Suarez, Bellarmine, four of our best Catholic thinkers ever, then just believe your common sense. Taxation in 1891 was like a tenth of what it is now. If you look at your total taxation as an American now, it's like a tenth of what it is now. And Leo's still talking about like, this is how it could get really unfair to the employers, to capital really fast. If the state's already taxing them too much, which ours does, 10 times more than employers were then that's really unfair. And it also follows that they're not going to be able to pay their employees what we're asking them to pay. So think of the role that a tyrannical scheme of progressive income tax and capitation and excises and imposts, sales tax, puts on the ability of employers to pay fair wages to their employees. You never hear that part, particularly not from Catholics. We're used to this sort of semi-socialist liberation theology. It's nonsense. 48's really banal and just repeats stuff. 49, first sentence, quite interesting. The most important of all working men's unions for these, the most important of the enumerated societies for mutual help are working men's unions. For these virtually include all the rest. History attests what excellent results were brought about by the artificers' guilds of olden times. So there's nothing progressive about this. He keeps saying the artificers' guilds of the medieval times are what we need to go back to, and those were Catholic. They're mostly private, but if they're state sanctioned, then they were Catholic state sanctioned from the medieval times. Nothing progressive there. We know unions exist. They shouldn't be run by Jimmy Hoffa in the mob or the commies working with Jimmy Hoffa and the mob. They should be by and for really Catholic workmen. That's not a progressive claim at all. That does nothing really to challenge, should not challenge anyone's deep held belief in any way, unless you're a communist. So let's go here to what paragraph was that, Seth?
That was 49. The first line of 49.
Okay. Now we jump to paragraph 50. I'm pulling out the most interesting heart of each paragraph. Second sentence, we read in the pages of Holy Writ, it is better that two should be together than one, for they have the advantage of their society. If one fall, he shall be supported by the other. Woe to him that is alone, for when he falleth, he has none to lift him up. So imagine even when you get a cold and you're the only person in your family that's sick with it. When the second person falls ill, you're drinking tea together, you're watching movies together, you're convalescing together. There's a cheeriness to it. This is scripture. The consciousness of his own weakness urges man to call in aid from without, is the first sentence. And Leo goes on to say, it is this natural impulse which binds men together in civil society. And it is likewise this which leads them to join together in associations which are, it is true, lesser and not independent societies, but nevertheless real societies. So working men's guilds, when they're Catholic, they're real societies. Don't write them off. The bottom part of the next paragraph, 51, is interesting. He says, private societies then, although they exist within the body politic and are severally part of the commonwealth, cannot nevertheless be absolutely and as such prohibited by public authority. Of course not. He's saying they should exist. For to enter into a society of this kind is the natural right of man. So entering into a union, Leo also calls a natural right. No problem here. I don't know why that's supposed to be left wing. And the state has for its office to protect natural rights, not to destroy them. And if it forbid its citizens to form associations, it contradicts the very principle of its own existence. For both they and it exist in virtue of the like principle, namely the natural tendency of man to dwell in society. I still am yet to see a single line which is leftist here. To support a union is not leftist, it's not progressive, it's a medieval institution, and they shouldn't be run by socialists. He keeps saying that. I see nothing. Now, it gets pretty banal here when he's just repeating these ideas that there should be proper sort of Catholic unions to help vouchsafe the rights of working classes, because they're the weaker party in the power dynamic. 52, the middle part of the paragraph says, in such cases, public authority may justly forbid the formation of such associations when they're joined together, which are evidently bad, unlawful, or dangerous to the state. So states can outlaw them with good cause, right? Well, and they may dissolve them if they already exist. We don't need so many unions. Again, this is very right-wing stuff. But every precaution should be taken not to violate the rights of individuals and not to impose unreasonable regulations under pretext of public benefit. Quite banal. Public unions, let's say, tradesmen's guilds should exist. They exist for the cause of religion and to ensure that wage earners are single in their household. They're singular. This sounds very right-wing. And by the way, if they are dangerous socialist organizations or secularist organizations, they can be dissolved without violation of the natural right. Just the state has to allow good Catholic ones. Duh. Go to the next paragraph. The bottom part's the most interesting. He says, with all the more reason we do complain, because at the very time when the law proclaims that association is free to all, we see that Catholic societies, however peaceful and useful, are hampered in every way, whereas the utmost liberty is conceded to individuals whose purposes are at once hurtful to religion and dangerous to the commonwealth. So now he's gearing up for Longínqua. He wouldn't write it for 4 more years, but he's getting us ready for the arguments he's going to make in Longínqua, and I really want to jump to that as quick as I can. Next paragraph, 54. There's a good deal of evidence in favor of the opinion that many of these societies are in the hands of secret leaders and are managed on principles ill according with Christianity and the public well-being. So he's saying that a lot of these societies are socialist.
Wow.
And that they do their utmost to get within their grasp the whole field of labor, they're corrupt, and force working men either to join them or to starve. So Pope Leo XIII even knows the gang boss Jimmy Hoffa trick that would really be popularized in the middle 20th century, maybe after the Depression. The real thugs and bullies are the union leaders. Join our union or starve. They tried to do this the 1 year I taught public high school in California. My first year we were married at a very, very corrupt inner city school. I taught a total of 7 years at that Catholic school over 2 stints, but I taught 1 year. I taught an 8th year, my first year really, at a public school. And I was like the only teacher out of a huge school, like 200 teachers. It was me and one other that did not join the teachers union, the CTA. Super corrupt and powerful in California. Pro all the leftist stuff, Pope Leo had my back in this. You shouldn't have to join them or starve, he says. Direct quote, under these circumstances, Christian working men must do one of two things. Either join associations in which their religion will be exposed to peril if they're bullied into it, or form associations among themselves and unite their forces to shake off courageously the yoke of so unrighteous and intolerable an oppression. Well, this sounds pretty good. He's just saying there need to be Catholic unions. 55, the next one. Those Catholics are worthy of all praise, and there are not a few who, understanding what the times require, have striven by a lot of reading, by various undertakings and endeavors to better the condition of the working class by rightful means. They have taken up the cause of the working man and have spared no efforts to better the condition both of families and individuals, and to infuse a spirit of equity into the mutual relations of employers and employed, to keep before the eyes of both classes the precepts of duty and the laws of the gospel. I mean, it's a very thorough, yet I would say a banal treatment of this is why we need Catholic working men's guilds. Nothing left-wing about that. Paragraph 56, in order that an association may be carried on with unity of purpose and harmony of action, its administration and government should be firm and wise. Okay, nothing controversial about that. You need to get good leaders of unions. 57, to sum up, then we may lay it down as a general and lasting law that working men's associations should be so organized and so governed as to furnish the best and most suitable means for attaining what is aimed at. That is to say, for helping each individual member to better his condition to the utmost in body, soul, and property. Pretty straightforward.
Nice.
So I didn't do this, right? Then 58, 59, 60 are all pretty straightforward. They're just saying in glowing terms these encomiums of praise for a proper working man's guild, which will always be Catholic, he's saying. Cool. I didn't do this on Monday. On Monday, it was a lot of stuff you hadn't heard. This is all I'm doing today is really showing you that as we round out, I'm going to go 61. It ends on 64. He's basically just saying goodbye. It's like 61, 62, I think are the only other paragraphs I cover. He's saying nothing that really can be taken for leftism when he supports working men's guilds. End of 61. They cannot but perceive that their grasping employers too often treat them with great inhumanity and hardly care for them outside the profit that their labor brings. And if they belong to any union, it is probably one in which there exists, instead of charity and love, that intestine strife, that means civil war, which ever accompanies poverty when unresigned and unsustained by religion. You can't join a socialist union, is what he's telling you. Broken in spirit and worn down in body, how many of them would gladly free themselves from such galling bondage? But human respect or the dread of starvation makes them tremble to take the step. To such as these, Catholic associations are of incalculable surface. You need to have a Catholic union if you're a working man. By helping them out of their difficulties, inviting them to companionship, and receiving the returning wanderers to a haven where they may securely find repose. 62 basically just repeats that. 63 is the last paragraph we really treat of. And this, I'll tell you something interesting about the date right now. 63, in regard to the church, her cooperation will never be found lacking, be the time or the occasion what it may, and she will intervene with all the greater effect and proportion as her liberty of action is the most unfettered. Let this be carefully taken to heart by those whose office it is to safeguard the public welfare. Every minister of holy religion must bring to the struggle the full energy of his mind and all the power of his endurance. Okay, that's all pretty banal stuff. I did not skip anything of moment. Yes, there was nothing. There's no crypto leftist nugget in 61 or 62. He's just repeating himself a lot here. And then the final paragraph in 64, he just says, on each of you, venerable brethren, and on your clergy and people, is an earnest of God's mercy and mark of our affection. We lovingly in the Lord bestow the apostolic benediction, given at St. Peter's in Rome, the 15th day of May, 1891, the 14th year of our pontificate. 15th day of May, that's tomorrow. Almost hit it directly on the head.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah, it's funny.
Well done. Yes,
So,
sir.
I mean, that the takeaways from Rerum Novarum are Aquinas is a big-time right-winger. private, Thomistic Leo takes private property from Aquinas. He calls it nearly a right, a corollary of a right. Leo bumps it up to a right. And Leo even discusses liberty of contract, life, liberty, property. Usually liberty means liberty of contract, if you didn't understand that. In John Locke, life, liberty, property. Liberty of contract just means you can alienate your goods, you can alienate your labor, you can buy things from other people, you can buy land, you can buy personality, you can lease things. That's all liberty of contract. You're always entering into a contract when you exercise your liberty in the mind of the law. So private property, private contracts, which really sounds like capitalism, not like socialism, but it's Catholic free enterprise, where there are groups of working men that can band together to make sure they're getting a fair shake. There's no problem with this, particularly given all the boundaries set up by Leo. It's remarkable that people call that left wing. But the other big idea is subsidiarity is set forth as the other new teaching by Leo. He repeats Thomas's warnings about heavy taxation upon employers. Taxes are more than 10 times what they were if you total them up. In 1891, I mean, corrected for inflation, we have like 10 times more tax. They're paying like 5% of their taxes. The average person pays about 50 if you include income tax. Excessive. So really, one of the takeaways, if you synthesize all of this, is not to stick up for capital too much, but they kind of have an excuse that Leo's giving them as an out here. They're overtaxed. This has made it legitimately hard for them to pay what's owed to the worker. And the final right-wing point of this really, really majestic encyclical is that he says at the beginning, he says that at the end, this is for single wage earning households, so that you always have fathers working, never mothers, and fathers can support their family on a single income. I mean, I don't know a document that's been circulated that's more consistent with the first pillar of this channel, like subsidiary, Catholic, American-styled subsidiarity, if you will. Now, let's move into Longínqua. There's a major mind blower involved by this.
This is another encyclical by Leo, right?
Yeah, 1895. This is the 1895 encyclical. And it's written specifically about America.
Ooh.
Now, you couple it with Rerum Novarum, which is about, new capitalism, and you really say, wow, these are kind of written for us. Really heavy to the Catholic Republic that is America. America is the nation, wired Catholic, labeled Protestant, and currently functioning secular, the most famous line from this book. It's been quoted quite often. He also wrote this letter to the American bishops, and in both Longínqua, the full name is Longínqua Oceani, and in Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae, the letter to the American bishops, which he wrote 4 years after that. Longínqua 4 years after Rerum, and Testem Benevolentiae 4 years after Longínqua. What he's really saying is that America has done much for the cause of Christianity. That's a direct quote from Testem Benevolentiae. It's been great, but Leo sees a new heresy being whispered about in the turn of the century America, 1895, 1899. People wanting to change America, specifically the Freemasons wanting to change America. We're going to see what change they wanted to make that Leo hated. Leo loved America. Contrary to what the trads tell you, Leo loved America, early America, same as I do. This book, we love the Anti-Federalist Papers. We love really the Articles of Confederation. We even love the early Constitution up until about the Civil War. But the problem is, around the time of the Civil War, America became a proto-socialist nation. And after FDR and World War II, it became a socialist nation and kind of a globalist nation concerning the development of Israel and things like that. It just became really, really evil. All this stuff was happening right in the post-war period. That's what we're going to talk about now. First, let me read you a brief description of what Longínqua stands for, propositionally, because we're not going to go through every paragraph. It's a lot shorter. You can read it easily if you want. We're not going to read all of Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae either. I just want to give you a brief description. Here it is. It was published January 6th, 1895. The main ideas of Longinqua Oceani in 1895 encyclical by Leo XIII revolve around the American Church's positive development and the importance of a close relationship between the Catholic Church and the state, rather than the separation of church and state becoming prevalent in the U.S. There's a mistake here in the AI. The Pope expressed concerns about Americanism, a term used to describe certain cultural and theological trends within the American Catholic community, within America more broadly, but they were trends of change away from what was good that worked for America in the 18th and 19th centuries. That was a goal of the Freemasons to bring about in the 20th century, including the emphasis on individual freedom, which people get twisted off about. That really just means family freedom if you're a Catholic, and the potential for the separation of church and state. Now, why is it potential for separation of church and state? A bunch of the trads that spurred out when I first published this book said, no, America was founded on the principle of the separation of church and state. Now, a lot of people know where I'm going with this. That's absolute hogwash. Absolutely wrong. And to prove how wrong it is, let me read from Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae, one of the most glowing passages, which is written 4 years after Longinqua. So it's not like anything changed in those 4 years, because it would only be getting worse. He writes, "We have thought it fitting that this letter should be addressed specifically to you, bishops of America. It will also be our care to see that copies are sent to the bishops of the United States, testifying again to that love by which we embrace your whole country." Leo loved America. "A country which in past times has done so much for the cause of religion." Early America did so much for the cause of religion. I'll explain what he's talking about there. It's the opposite of what you've been brainwashed to think. "And which will, by divine assistance, continue to do still greater things." Sound like the shining city on the hill that you're kind of taught to laugh at? America's a Masonic Protestant nation, not by ideology. Maybe a lot of the early people were Masonic Protestants, but the ideology was all ripped off from Catholicism. That's why Leo says what he says. Even he sees reifying a new name for a forthcoming heresy called Americanism. "To you and to all the faithful of America, we grant most lovingly, as a pledge of divine assistance, our apostolic benediction." So this is an encomium of praise for early America, and he sees it changing after about 100 years of its life. Teenager America. See that? See how it works. When you read things, that's Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae in 1899, and you read from Longinqua, 1895, you find you've basically been lied to. Americanism is in the years around 1900, not in the years around 1800. That's early America when things worked here. A political and religious outlook attributed to some American Catholics and denounced as heresy by the Holy See, which I completely agree with. Now, it was change that they're striving to bring about, an opposite change, that the Freemasons in America, working together with early weird bedfellows like the ACLU, Protestants, Masons, these are all amicus curiae on the Supreme Court case, which is so central to what I'm going to be talking about today, called Everson versus Board of Ed, 1947. This represents what Leo was denouncing in both Longinqua and in Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae. In the 1890s, European continental conservative clerics detected early signs of modernism, classical liberalism, badly defined term, because private property and private contract rights, which we know Leo loved, are often lumped in with classical liberalism. But Pope Pius IX had condemned modernism in the Syllabus of Errors in 35 years before, in 1864, among the beliefs and teachings of many members of the American Catholic hierarchy who denied the charges. Now, the reason that members of the American hierarchy could deny the charges of Americanism, leveled in both Testem Benevolentiae and Longinqua, is because there was a growing trend. It was still a whisper, and it would grow into a shout by the 1930s and 1940s when the Freemasons effected the change. Pope Leo XIII wrote against these ideas in a letter to Cardinal James Gibbons, published as Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae. James Gibbons was an American. He wants him to distribute it to all the American bishops, and he's repeating a lot of the stuff in Longínqua. The long-term result was that the Irish Catholics, who largely controlled the Catholic Church in the U.S., increasingly demonstrated loyalty to the Pope and suppressed traces of liberal thought in Catholic colleges. At bottom, the conflict was cultural. Okay, so we don't have to go through Longínqua or Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae. I just want you to know, I'll go through the opening of Longínqua. And then I'm gonna school you. I'm gonna put on a clinic as to what really Leo is talking about, because I'm not going against Leo at all. I 100% think he was right. Americanism is evil. It is a Masonic doctrine. The Protestants colluded with the ACLU and the Masons. You can even read it in the case Everson versus Board of Ed. The Separation of Church and State by Philip Hamburger is a life-changing book, because you've been brainwashed to think that separation of church and state was hailed as a desideratum in America. No, it was always a charge in early America. It was an accusation. This commie wants to separate church and state. After 100 years of the First Amendment, people still said separation's a bad thing. It was a charge. It was an allegation against someone. It was the opposite of what the First Amendment stood for. What? I'm doing the Michael Scott. What? Really? No. Yes, I am right. Yeah, correct. I am right. Thank you, me. So here's Longínqua, and then I'll get to the corrective. Encyclical of Pope Leo XIII on Catholicism in the United States follows up with a more or less, it's not an encyclical, but the letter Testem Benevolentiae. To the archbishops and bishops of the United States, we traverse in spirit and thought the wide expanse of ocean, which is what the name means, the wide expanse of ocean. And although we have at other times addressed you in writing, chiefly when we directed encyclical letters to the bishops of the Catholic world, yet have we now resolved to speak to you separately, trusting that we shall be, God willing, of some assistance to the Catholic cause amongst you. To this we apply ourselves with the utmost zeal and care, because we highly esteem and love exceedingly the young and vigorous American nation, in which we plainly discern latent forces for the advancement alike of civilization and of Christianity. Not long ago, when your whole nation, as was fitting, celebrated with grateful recollection and every manifestation of joy the completion of the 4th century since the discovery of America, we too commemorated together with you that most auspicious event, sharing in your rejoicings with equal goodwill. So this is just more love. Nothing. It's a love fest for America. When do we get to Americanism? We'll explain. Nor were we on that occasion content with offering prayers at a distance for your welfare and greatness. It was our wish to be in some manner present with you in your festivities. Hence, we cheerfully sent one who should represent our person. Not without good reason did we take part in your celebration. For when America was, as yet, but a newborn babe, uttering in its cradle its first feeble cries, the Church took it to her bosom in motherly embrace. Columbus, as we have elsewhere expressly shown, sought as the primary fruit of his voyages and labors to open a pathway for the Christian faith into new lands and new seas. Do you see how based this is? Pro-Columbus, it's pro-evangelization, it's not pro-Indian or savage or whatever. It's just really good. Keeping this thought constantly in view, his first solicitude, wherever he disembarked, was to plant upon the shore and sacred emblem of the cross. Beautiful. Wherever, like as the Ark of Noah, surmounting the overflowing waters, bore the seed of Israel together with the remnants of the human race, even thus did the barks launched by Columbus upon the ocean carry into regions beyond the seas, as well as the germs of the mighty states, the principles of the Catholic religion. This is not a place to give a detailed account of what thereupon ensued. Very rapidly did the light of the gospel shine upon the savage tribes discovered by the Ligurian. Okay, so he's going to talk about how the project of America was always spreading the gospel and Christianity. Beautiful. The ideas of America are Catholic. Leo, he doesn't make quite the exact argument I do that Protestants plagiarized, but he makes this argument in a couple scant places. Protestants, if they wanted a working new nation, this young America, you have to have the idea of natural rights. Protestants had rejected natural law, the natural law of Aristotle. But as Christians, they lifted from Christian natural law thinkers. The only Christian natural law thinkers are Catholics. Eastern Orthodox are not. Protestants are not. So they wanted natural rights, life, liberty, property. So Locke et al. Were Whigs. The Americans called themselves neo-Whigs, and they're like, well, we have to read the guys that Locke's really reading. Bellarmine, Suarez, Thomas, Aristotle. So the crypto-Catholic ideas of natural rights. Subsidiarity, the term hadn't even been coined yet, but the idea of federalism is a perfect American expression of subsidiarity. It's that it's a grave wrong for a further away government, the federal government, to do what a local government could do, just as Thomas Jefferson said this. I prefer the state to the nation, yes. But more than this, I prefer the county to the state. I prefer the city to the county, and I prefer the father or the working man to the city. That is subsidiarity. Subsidiarity does not mean you buy local from your greengrocer the way you're lied to by crunchy trad Catholics. It means you're governed locally, and it really begins with the father. It means you're governed locally. And same thing with virtue ethics. This means Aristotelian ethics. The Protestants had rejected these. All of the founding fathers, even if they're Protestants, said you need virtue ethics, you need subsidiarity or federalism, you need natural rights, and you need the opposite of a separation of church and state. Now, this brings us to the ratification contest. Leo knows all this in Longínqua, and he's a very smart guy. 88 encyclicals. In Longínqua and Testa Benevolentia, he's operating on these assumptions. He's operating on the assumptions that Americans know who they are and what they are. You guys don't. You've been brainwashed by 20th century, post-World War II, frankly, Jewish communists who told you that the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights in general are something that they're not. So, really brief history. I prefer the Articles of Confederation, which was a really strong subsidiary and first constitution for the original 13 states. We had the Articles of Confederation, which left the states really their own republics, but they banded together to fight Great Britain. And it was on the books for like 11 years, from 76 to 87. They started wanting during the late 1780s, the big government types in America, like Hamilton, or at that time, Madison. Madison was a flip-flopper. They started wanting, after things like the Shays Rebellion, which was based on currency, stronger binding currency, stronger binding way to get taxes other than what was called at the time the requisition system from states. So they tried to get the 13 states, they were states now, not just colonies, because they'd won their independence a couple years before, together to reform the Articles of Confederation into a stronger constitution. They did so at Annapolis, Maryland. They didn't bring George Washington, and no one came. George Washington was a cult of personality. So the Federalists, the people that wanted a stronger central government than the Articles, said, we could really only meet in the summers because the weather was too bad to travel for the New Englanders. Next summer, let's get everyone together. We'll call George Washington there, and we're not going to leave it to chance. So at Philadelphia, a year later, Washington was there. They had an illegal document that was basically pre-drafted, semi-pre-drafted. It was not a new Articles of Confederation or amendments. They just basically tossed out the Articles of Confederation. This was a wholly new constitution. They shuttered the windows, and they really, even though the Articles were supposed to be amended only by unanimous vote of all 13 states, they didn't have that. They basically just forced all 13 states to you're either in or out on this new constitution. You don't have to be in if you don't want, but if you're not in, then you have to deal with the Indian tribes and the British and the French to get on your own without this League of Nations. And so they pitched this new constitution, Madison did et al., and it was a much stronger central government. I'd prefer to go back to the Articles of Confederation where your state is really your country, but that doesn't look like it's going to happen. And they said, okay, go back to your individual 13 states and ratify this by next summer. That would be the summer of 1788. And I studied in great depth in law school every minute the ratification contest in the most important state, Virginia, the next summer. And the next summer, 1788, is when they actually had enough states ratify, I think it was 9, to ratify to make this La Cosa Nostra a new thing. And then the other 4 states are like, well, we're going to join in because we don't want to be left out in the cold, even though we don't like this. The people that didn't like the new Constitution were called anti-federalists. It's very important to Longinqua and Testem Benevolentiae. The anti-federalists there were some that just flat out didn't want to join this new big government union because they said the nation will swallow up the state, which ended up happening. They were right. The anti-federalist papers are very, very, they're more elegant, and they call with greater acumen what's going to happen in the future than the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are mostly just, propaganda. You send your kids to what's it called? Hillsdale College. And they're like, we do right-wing stuff. We have them read the Federalist Papers. Have them read the Federalist Papers with the anti-Federalist Papers, because one set of documents is clearly superior and called the future far better, and that's the anti-federalists. So these are guys like mainly Jeffersonians, James Monroe, our 5th president, lots of leading lights, George Mason, Patrick Henry, were all anti-federalists. Why? Because they didn't trust this big government. So they said, the long and the short is they said, all right, I guess we'll go for the new Constitution, but you have to promise us a Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights, you know what that is. I'm not going to go through it. But the first one's most important because it's the one that mentions that it's Congress alone shall not violate this establishment clause. Congress shall not establish law. Actually, Congress shall not make laws with which respect, meaning regard, an establishment of religion. You've been taught, and I mean really brainwashed, after 1947, that this means that Congress will not allow states to make laws which establish sects of Christianity. Wrong. 8 of the 13 states in 1788 and 1791, the Bill of Rights came in 3 years later in 1791, ratified in 1788 with a provisional Bill of Rights promised by James Madison. He wrote the Bill of Rights. Came in 3 years later, still 8 of the 13 states, the day before the First Amendment was ratified. The First Amendment made it illegal for Congress to undo the official Christian religion of 8 of those 13 states. In other words, they kind of supposed that 13 out of 13 states would have an official state sect of Christianity. It was Congregationalist in the north and basically Anglican in the south. And they thought all 13 would. Well, it maintained only 8 of the 13, but that's most of them. And the First Amendment explicitly means and meant, continued meaning the day after they ratified it, Congress is not allowed to make a law disestablishing the individual state establishments of religion. So, New England states were Congregationalists. The individual state had an official religion, Congregationalist, sort of Puritan Christianity. You can look into it. Most of the southern states had an Anglican official state religion, Anglican Christian. If one of the states had enough Catholics, Maryland would probably have been closest. Maybe Rhode Island was very Catholic as well. If they had just a few more Catholics, they could have had a Catholic establishment of religion, just the way the integralists wanted. It was this way from 1791, and the states could choose whether or not they would continue to be integralist. But the states were integralist, and the First Amendment stands for state as opposed to nation integralism. All the First Amendment said is that there can't be a national religion, A, and B, the national legislature, the Congress, cannot disestablish the state official religions, which were all Christian. And each state can have any sect of Christianity it wants. That is the First Amendment. Now, it stood until 1947. After the Civil War, Lincoln and his Marxist cabinet, they were Marxists, they wanted to undo the ability of states to have their own official religion, their own set of moral laws, to decide about questions of legal morality on their own, which is what really the Civil War was all about. It was a Marxist imposition of the nation on the state. And so Lincoln ends up, as his sort of, his presidency's birthright, ends up getting the 14th Amendment ratified. This undoes all of this states' rights stuff. And the Supreme Court, it got to, the 14th Amendment got ratified in 1868, right? So you're coming closer in time to these encyclicals by these 3 encyclicals by Leo XIII. Is Testem Benevolentiae actually considered an encyclical? It's a letter to Gibbons, but I think it might be considered an encyclical. It's not terrifically important. I'm going to call it an encyclical because it's a letter.
All the guys on Twitter are going to be like, well, we have to discount everything you just said because it's not.
yeah, exactly. An encyclical is just a letter, and these were all letters written. The latter of 2 were specifically written to America. So 1868, the 14th Amendment gets passed. Yes, Lincoln had already died, but this was sort of his desideratum. This is what he stood for, destroying states' rights. And with the 14th Amendment, you would see after 1868, between 1868 and really when the Marxists took over America, and now it's just sort of a Marxist, national, globalist hellhole. No offense, but Leo XIII would agree with me. After the Civil War, it was just a creep. Between 1868 and let's say 1947, they would use the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court would, the Jewish Masonic Marxists on the Supreme Court would use it to one by one sort of destroy states' rights. So I mean things like the right of states to ban pornography. This is a 14th Amendment. Well, actually, let's start with Everson versus Board of Ed in 1947. This was a 14th Amendment case where the Supreme Court, 7 of 9 court jurists were Freemasons, open and notorious Freemasons. That number would rise to 8 of 9 in the 1950s. 7 of 9 owned being Masons. And what Leo had seen at the end of the previous century, the end of the 1800s, was that the Freemasons had said their goal for America was establishing a separation of church and state, the opposite of what America was, the opposite of the First Amendment. Well, using the 14th Amendment, Lincoln's 14th Amendment in 1947, Amicus Curiae, the ACLU, a bunch of Masonic Protestants, and some other interesting groups. Oh, and the KKK, because they hated Catholics. All of these groups hated Catholics. ACLU, Masons, Protestants, and the KKK all passed as friends of the court, Amicus Curiae, Everson versus Board of Ed, which reversed the meaning of the First Amendment. The First Amendment had meant for 150 years or so that Congress cannot disestablish state establishments of Christianity. Now, after 1947, the court just says with judge-made law, the magic, M-A-G-I-C-K, of judge-made law. No, the First Amendment, under the new auspices of the 14th Amendment, now means the exact opposite, that states cannot have a separation, cannot have an official state sect of Christianity. They made it illegal. That's why you think that's what the First Amendment means. Comes from Everson versus Board of Education. Using the 14th Amendment as a new kind of hermeneutic of, not continuity, hermeneutic of rupture, they reversed the First Amendment, which required that Congress leave the state establishments of Christianity, the 13 states, whichever of the 50 states wanted to have a sect of Christian religion as their official religion. Congress couldn't touch it. Now it said that basically the federal government had to overturn it, and it was de facto overturned after Everson versus Board of Ed. That's what Leo XIII saw coming. He saw Masons and Protestants and KKK types and ACLU types colluding in America against the Catholics to undo our Catholic lawfare. I told you the Constitution was Catholic. That's the whole argument of this book. I explain it really well in this book. It's hard to believe because you've been propagandized so far the other way. But Leo knew that America's understanding was Catholic, even if it was mainly Protestants, and that we didn't have a separation of church and state. A separation of church and state at the state level was illegal until 1947. It was all the 14th Amendment that did this, that enabled the Supreme Court to do it. Then in 1965, individual states had most of them made it illegal to sell contraception. Griswold versus Connecticut, using the 14th Amendment, the Masons on the court overturned that. They said it's now illegal for states to make contraception bans. It's now illegal to make contraception illegal. So it was the nation imposing on the Catholic-minded states a ban on contraception bans. That was 1965, 18 years after Everson used the 14th Amendment to make state establishments of religion illegal. 18 years later, they made state bans on contraception illegal. 4 years later, in 1969, Stanley versus Georgia, the Masonic Freemason SCOTUS made it illegal for individual states to make pornography illegal. It was a ban on Catholic-minded states banning it. They said there's a national ban on banning. It's illegal. You can't have your own state religion. 1947, always Christianity. 1965, you can't, individual states can't ban contraception. 1969, individual states under Stanley couldn't ban pornography. 1973, you've heard of this one, Roe versus Wade. My state overturned it 3 years ago. 1973, 4 years later, individual states can't ban abortion. It was the nation saying it's illegal to ban abortion. All 50 states have to have it. 92 or 93, Lawrence versus Texas, individual states can't ban sodomy. There's all 14th Amendment. All of these Masonic cases were using the evil 14th Amendment to ban state bans on things, to destroy subsidiarity. So see, original America had subsidiarity, so much so that we had the First Amendment, which said each state can have its own religion. You can have your own Baptist state, which is what it would be here in Mississippi if we undid Everson and went back to the first true amendment. Maybe in Maryland, it would be Catholic. There are states where it would be Catholic if they hadn't. There are lots of states where it would be Catholic if we went back to the true First Amendment and undid 1947 Everson versus Board. Oh, there's another 14th Amendment case, Obergefell v. Hodges, which made it illegal for individual Christian states to ban gay marriage. Also done under the 14th Amendment. This is what Leo saw coming at the turn of the century in 1895 and 1899 when he wrote those two encyclicals respectively, Longinqua and then Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae. Both to Americans. Can you believe that? Can you believe that red pill? Can you swallow it? I guess you swallow a red pill, you don't believe it. That Leo loved early America, same as this book is all about early America, first 100 years, 125 years. He recognized it became evil during the Civil War, and this led to the 14th Amendment, which led to this series of Masonic court cases. He saw it all unfolding about halfway between the Civil War and some of the bad court cases. But the 14th Amendment's what did it all. Amazing, right? Leo, that's because I've even had trads say, why does Leo love America so much? But then he comes up with the doctrine of Americanism, and that's a heresy. Because Americanism is a Catholic, an ideologically Catholic nation giving way to a Masonic nation. And that's what we live in now. And that's what the 14th Amendment is. And that's what violations of subsidiarity are. Violations of subsidiarity are Masonic. Pius IX, Pius XI's predecessor and Leo XIII's predecessor, loved the subsidiarity of early America. So much so that he really, if he had to pick a side, he sided with the Confederacy. He didn't love slavery, but he loved Jefferson Davis. He loved what they stood for. He didn't like one subsidiarian local government being forced into an evil, liberal, Lincolnian union. And you know how we know is because of the Italian Risorgimento. This had just happened to him. Pius IX had his land stolen by a Freemason called Garibaldi, who forced him to be part of this big, evil, queer, liberal nation of Italy. And he didn't want that. He wanted the Papal States. By the way, Lincoln saw exactly what was happening to Pius IX. And did he sympathize with Pius IX? No. Lincoln sympathized with Italy, Risorgimento. You just forced the small localities into this big, queer, liberal, new, modern sort of proto-globalist nation state. How'd you do that, man? Lincoln loved Garibaldi. He offered him a high-ranking spot in the Union Army because he said, what you just did to Pope Pius IX, I want you to do to the Confederacy here in America. That's what Pius IX loved, the Confederacy. Don't buy the propaganda. People say, oh, Pius IX did. He wrote Jefferson Davis a letter of consolation, but he didn't love him. He's the only diplomat who ever called Jefferson Davis honorable president. That means very much. All the other ones are like, well, you're a rebel. He alone, among all the world's diplomats, called him honorable president. It's because of this, because of the understanding of subsidiarity I'm talking about. And Leo XIII got it. He knew that in the late 1890s, America was in a series of dangerous changes, going from an ideologically Catholic country to an ideologically Masonic country. And the greatest mark of this was separation of church and state, an un-American idea, an anti-American idea, an anti-First Amendment idea. Do your own research. Check me. That's what Longinqua and Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae are all about. Leo's saying, don't do it, guys. Stay integralist at the state level. You know, even if it's Protestant, it's not integralist, formally speaking, because that would be Catholic states. But you're a bunch of Protestants, so at least keep your Protestant establishments. Maybe you'll get enough Catholics in Maryland to have a state-integrated religion of Catholicism in Maryland. Who knows? It could be that today. A bunch of states would have that today, if not for the 14th Amendment, Lincoln, the Masons, the Marxists, the KKK, the people on the bench in this country. That's what is Americanism. Modern America is evil. Post-World War II America is evil. It's globalist, it's Marxist, it's anti-subsidiarity. Early America was beautiful. That's what Leo XIII thinks. So now you understand Americanism. Americanism is, don't change, guys, you were great. You've done so much for the cause of religion. Why else would he say that?
Never change.
Never change. Always be yourself.
Never change.
What's really cool is being who you really are, boys and girls, especially if you're American. So that's what I have. That's Rerum Novarum, really, really special import for Americans because of what he was writing about. And then Longinqua and Testem Benevolentiae, specifically for Americans. You read those three together, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, I want to go in depth on what the meaning of these are and read Catholic Republic. You get the whole meaning in these rather than reading just three encyclicals, and it's all well explained and it's all sort of self-contained. Super chats?
You know what? I forgot to put the banner up there. So if anybody has a problem with Tim said or a comment, then please feel free to super chat right now. Let me put the banner up.
If you want dating coaching, you want marriage coaching, or you want the bridge between them, if you want matchmaking, then use this retrograde matchmaking service. We're taking up the mantle of what we've done the last 2 years. Now it'll be Steph and myself still as matchmakers with Jillian Curvers, my cousin, who's running this course for us. Go to timothyjgordon.com if you're interested.
timothyjgordon.com. Let's see if there's any comments. Somebody saying that the KKK had free Masonic members.
all of their names, like the Grand Cyclops and all the wizard shit comes from the Masons. Yeah. Now the most conspicuous character is Hugo Black, who, according to his best friend, could make the best anti-Catholic speech you ever heard, who was on the Supreme Court during all this transformative time in the middle of the century. He was a KKK member. He was a huge player in reversing the separation of church and state doctrine. The First Amendment stands for illegalizing separation of church and state, forced separation of church and state, nation upon state. Hugo Black is the conspicuous former KKK group leader who hated Catholics and reversed the meaning. And then this is another reason, don't send your kids to school, even if they go to Catholic school. They'll be brainwashed by the Houghton Mifflin textbooks, which tell you that the First Amendment required separation all along. Total and complete lie. I mean, this is not like a conspiracy theory. This is demonstrable. Separation of church and state was illegal from 1791, when the First Amendment was ratified, all the way until 1947. And then it became not only legal, but the requirement of the First Amendment. It would just be like if I said, here's this law X. The law requires you to eat 3 candies a day.
Amazing.
And then some interpreter said the law requires you never to eat 3 candies a day. Well, that's not just a change, that's a reversal. That, my friend, is a revolution.
Let's see here. Somebody's asking if you've read the sequel to Father Elijah.
Yeah, and I love Michael O'Brien, and he's a friend, and he gave me great advice. It doesn't, in my critical opinion, nearly suffice. Father Elijah is one of the greatest modern novels I've ever read. I'll say that. And Elijah in Jerusalem, I wish it took us in the equally exciting direction that the whole book of Father Elijah went. I don't think it's a great sequel, but Father Elijah is one of the great modern novels, Catholic or not, of our time. So buy Father Elijah, read it if you haven't. I don't want to. Michael O'Brien's he's a great man. He's like a mystic, Irish Canadian guy. Gave me great advice. He writes me anytime I write him. So I don't want to. I'm not saying not to try Elijah in Jerusalem. Maybe someday I'll retry it, but it's regarded as a lesser son of a greater sire. The original Father Elijah. If you haven't read, go read it. I want to help Michael O'Brien. Read it. Published by Ignatius.
James Martinelli is saying Jeff Davis wore the brown scapular and a miraculous medal, even if he was not Catholic.
Yep, and he went to Catholic school. That's absolutely true. Jeff Davis wore the brown scapular, went to Catholic school. My favorite Confederate is, of course, Robert E. Lee, greatest American of all time, greater even than I think some of the founders. And he said, referring to Pio Nono, he said, your blessed Pope is the one in the world who loved most our poor Confederacy. Beautiful. The Confederates loved Pius IX, and Pius IX loved them. Don't listen to you're so propagandized about Civil War. Most people have noticed that World War II is something we are just always lied to about in Israel and all that. That's become reasonably popular. People don't know how much they've been lied to about the Civil War, and how much the Confederates loved Pius IX and Pius IX loved them. And they were very Catholic friendly, particularly where we have our home parish, the TLM parish in New Orleans, the center of Confederate Catholicism, very Catholic at the time.
Let's see here. Some super chats are coming in, so I'll get through some of these other questions here. But where did I? Jag Michael says Alexis de Tocqueville on the South. How do you refute it?
You'll have to. Again, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote a lot about the South. Complex writings. I couldn't. Some of it was good. Some of it was bad.
CB.
I don't know what you mean specifically.
Say in chat, and I'll try to clarify that question. CB sent a super chat, said, wait, Aquinas and Bellarmine support the right to revolution too, a la Locke. Where can I read more? America might not be that bad.
This is the book. Aquinas was the first philosopher, not first Catholic. Aquinas is the first philosopher to ever full-throatedly endorsed the right of rebellion as one of the natural rights. It was really like life, and he always had this liberty idea. But the right of rebellion, he says, yeah, if the tyrant violates your natural rights, a new natural right of rebellion kicks in. If it's under these conditions, you have to have, it basically has to satisfy the 4 conditions of just war, of any just war. But you can't, originally young Aquinas writes a document that says you could even put the king to death, like what I think happened to James the II.
Wow.
Eventually, I mean, James II wasn't around then. But then he reverses that and he says, well, you shouldn't put a king to death. Regicide, he no longer supported. But you could always have a revolution. We weren't trying to put Bonnie King George III to death. That we didn't want to. That's not what we tried to do. No one ever tried. It wasn't a thing. But Aquinas always supported the right of rebellion. There's one passage in his later life where he seems more on the fence about it, but arguably he's just applying just war. You have to really make sure that there's a difference between a rebellion and an insurrection. It has to be a just war. But he'd written on it a lot in his early life. It was really extreme, young Aquinas, that you could even kill a king. The consensus is, his position is, there's a right of rebellion. By the end, he says, don't kill the king, but it's got to be a just rebellion.
Somebody said Jeff Davis was a traitor.
Okay. That's novel. Where'd you come up with that? I'm sure that wasn't a Masonic history book written by the hoo-hoos. I'm sure it's informed by so much solid thinking on the matter. I mean, then you're saying that Blessed Pius IX was a traitor lover? That doesn't really make sense if you're a Catholic. And he called him an honorable president. So Pius IX begs to differ.
Julia says, read Behind the Lodge Door, which talks about Hugo Black.
Yeah, I've heard of that one. Yeah, he's their big hero. He's the one that changed it all. And this is what Leo XIII saw coming. At the turn of the century, America, he saw that they were going to change it all. And Hugo Black is sort of the central figure the central Mason Protestant guy who, out of his hatred for Catholics, really hurt the establishment of Protestant religion. We didn't even have a Catholic establishment ever in any of the states. They had 8 of them. And Hugo Black, because he hated Catholics so much, ended up destroying the legality of the 8 Protestant establishments. Really dumb.
Zachodemus says, my wife's Catholic school had a Margaret Sanger poster.
Of course.
That makes sense. Homeschool your kids.
Yeah, homeschool your kids.
Even the Catholic schools are bad. Okay, let's see.
And that's why wives, among many reasons why wives have to be home. You can't homeschool your kids if one of you is not home. And that's all schooling is, whether it's public ed or Catholic ed. People use it as babysitting daycare. You know this, but I'll just say it one more time. All right. Thank you guys very much. If you're interested in the matchmaking, go check out timothyjgordon.com. Buy Catholic Republic. If you don't have this book, everything I went through is explained in really simple diction and more. Because there are 6 chapters. I really covered 1.5 of them today. But it's kind of a red pill each chapter. I was lied to about natural rights. I was lied to about subsidiarity. I was lied to about Catholics in America. I was lied to about separation of church and state. I was lied to about virtue ethics. I was lied to about science and technology and the role in the republic. America's a Catholic republic, wired Catholic, labeled Protestant, currently functioning secular because they never made it officially Catholic. God bless. Deus Vult.